Hello. I want to welcome you to the 2007 Robert K. Webb Lecture. I'm Dan Ritchell from the Department of History. As many of you know, the Bob Webb Lecture is in honor of a former and beloved member of the History Department, a former chair of the department, a former provost of the university, a former editor of the American Historical Review, and to this day, one of the preeminent historians of British history in America. It's my great pleasure to introduce as our speaker today another historian who, in a short space of time, has achieved his own degree of preeminence, Dr. Seth Koven from the Department of History at Rutgers University. Has over the past decade and a half, 2 decades, emerged as one of the leading voices in the new cultural history of Victorian Britain. He has written extensively in that congested intersection of the history of gender, sexuality, representations of poverty, charity and welfare policy in late Victorian Britain. For those of you who are less familiar with the area, it's best described as Jack the Ripper's East London. So you might not appreciate that. Now, in his 2004 book entitled Slumming, Social and Sexual Politics in Victorian London, it's been described by reviewers as, and I quote, a book of power and elegance. Another reviewer described it as endowed with provocative brilliance, and yet another as one of the most important new contributions to the study of Victorian society. The book was awarded the Sonia Rudikoff Prize by the Northeast Victorian Studies Association as the best book in Victorian studies in 2005. Today, Dr. Koven will be speaking about part of his current research project on the Christian revolutionaries in the first half of the 20th century. The talk, as you all know, is entitled Mrs.Henry Hobhouse Goes to War, Conscience and Christian Radicalism in World War I Britain. I would like you to welcome Dr. Seth Khodam.
Thanks so much. What a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dan, for the lovely introduction, and to the History Department and the library for hosting me, and this spectacular room and this beautiful campus. It's really quite delightful to be here. And to get to give a lecture that has R.K. Webb's name attached to it is, for a British historian, a privilege in itself, because I have to say, as a graduate student, my advisor was not very generous in his praise of his rivals. But when it came to R.K. Webb, there was always a hush. Now there was greatness. And so just to be able to deliver this lecture is indeed a great honor. And of course, it's the morning after. And I think that at the end of the lecture, I hope, if I've timed it well enough, I'll get to talk a little bit about the morning after in relationship to some of the issues raised today. Because this is part of a series that deals with issues around human rights and conscience, and I will certainly be tying into that. Let's see what time we are. For the first 60 years of her life, until the outbreak of World War I in August 1914, Margaret Potter Hobhouse basked in the ample good fortune that had befallen her. Harboring no intellectual aspirations for herself, she had confined her political ambitions to encouraging her husband, the Right Honorable Henry, to follow generations of Hobhouses before him by sitting in Parliament. More efficient than tender, she expected her 4 sons to achieve distinction in public life and her 2 daughters to marry civic-minded men of wealth. You get the clan here. She thought deeply about the social conventions that governed the lives of wealthy women in Victorian England, and approvingly embraced most of them for herself. She never for a moment questioned the essential rightness of her privileges and her obligations as the daughter of a great railroad capitalist and the wife of a Somerset landed gentry magnate. Mrs. Hobhouse's world looked altogether different to her in March 1921 as she gasped for breath between debilitating bouts of coughing. With her younger sister, the world-renowned social policy expert and Fabian socialist, Beatrice Potter Webb, by her side, she took stock of it one last time. It was impossible to evade the painful truth that the husband for whom she long had done so much now preferred the distant comforts of his country estate to attending to her sickbed in London. They had been loyal partners and parents, but never intimate soulmates. Nor did her daughters offer much support and sympathy. Rachel felt too unloved by her mother to give any in return. An unmarried Eleanor, decently dutiful, was too absorbed in saving Austria's desperately hungry children to minister to her own mother's needs. Margaret tried to convince herself that she would be reunited in the spirit world with the youngest and best beloved of her 4 sons, Paul, so cruelly taken from her by enemy fire in the spring of 1918. She did have one unambiguous consolation. Margaret Hobhouse knew that she had single-handedly orchestrated, under her nom de guerre, Mrs. Henry Hobhouse, the war's most successful campaign of conscience to save her Christian pacifist, socialist, eccentric, forever sick son, Stephen, from a martyr's death in Exeter prison as a conscientious objector. No one, most of all Margaret Hobhouse herself, could ever have imagined that this fundamentally conventional woman and proudly patriotic mother of 3 soldiers on the Western Front would become Britain's most effective advocate on behalf of the fair treatment of conscientious objectors to war. Lieutenant General Wyndham Childs, her adamantine antagonist in the War Office, privately bemoaned his bad luck entangling with that pernicious woman, Margaret Hobhouse, while George Bernard Shaw gleefully relished her bonny bit of fighting against the Prime Minister Lloyd George's warfare state. As summer turned to autumn in 1917, war-weary Britons debated the merits of Mrs. Hobhouse's surprised, best-selling little book, I Appeal Unto Caesar, which elegantly laid out her case for releasing honorable men of conscience, like Stephen, from successive terms of hard labor imposed upon them for their absolute refusal to do any work to support the war effort. Distinguished men of letters, great novelists John Galsworthy, Edmund Gosse, Arthur Conan Doyle among them, came to verbal blows with one another over Mrs. Hobhouse's book. Ardent imperialists and former enemies in South Africa, Alfred Milner, Jan Smuts, they joined forces to demand the release of a man for whom empire and violence in all of its forms contradicted Christ's immutable law of love. Lloyd George's cabinet splintered into pro- and anti-Hobhouse factions, and erstwhile militarist patriots began to question the justness of a British state willing to countenance the imprisonment of one of its most conspicuously altruistic, kind, gentle, self-denying citizens. The leaders of wartime Britain needed to make Mrs. Hobhouse and her son go away. Could they do this without mocking the sacrifices of fighting men and their loved ones, for whom conscientious objectors, conchies, COs, like Stephen, embodied all that Britain and Britishness should never be? Mrs. Henry Hobhouse transformed maternal anguish into a cause célèbre that briefly threatened to derail the British warfare state. How did she do this? This talk analyzes precisely that. It explores her bonny bit of fighting, which compelled Britons to ask themselves troubling questions of enduring significance. What is conscience? Who gets to have one during wartime, and why? The answers, I will argue, can be found not only in the cool abstractions of philosophical ruminations, and there were many that this case provoked, but in the messy contingencies and the compromised particularities of history. The case of Stephen Hobhouse, as Mrs. Hobhouse brought it before the British public, threw into stark relief the challenges of defining patriotism and citizenship, motherhood and masculinity, in the context of a liberal state, small l, a state committed to ideas of openness and freedom and exchange of ideas. A liberal state at war, not only against enemies from without, but against many of its own first principles, its own most cherished traditions of liberty. So I'd ask you to think about the so-called Patriot Act to give a contemporary parallel. What are the boundaries at time of war? What rights does a state have to silence or censor or contain the flow of information and speech? The CO, Conscientious Objector, was a liberal state's most exquisite, logical non sequitur. And Stephen Hobhouse, the test case which exposed but could not resolve its logical absurdities. Mrs. Hobhouse and her rebellious firstborn child had disagreed with one another for so long about so many things. There she is, Stephen, and that's with his sister Rachel. But during these final years, they came probably for the only time in their lives to understand one another. The twin weapons in Mrs. Hobhouse's arsenal were calm reasonableness and ferocious mother love. It did not hurt her cause, and Stephen's, that she was bound by ties of kinship and friendship to much of the intellectual aristocracy and political elite that still largely governed early 20th century Britain. Mrs. Henry Hobhouse never left England's shores during these tumultuous years, but she most certainly had gone to war. Now, why do I care about this story, and why do I think you should? What are my ethical and intellectual investments? This is part of a project about 20th century Christian revolutionaries. And it's a group of people who gathered together and were accomplished figures in their own right, but were notably the children of eminent and good and powerful high Victorians. Their paths first crossed as members of a pacifist, very left-wing organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And they met in 1915. When Margaret Hobhouse lay dying in 1921, they authored a kind of sensational manifesto in which they declared that though they were the children of people of great wealth, they would enter into voluntary poverty. Why would they do this? Why would they give up all of their wealth? They did so because of the monumental task that they had set before them, to reconcile West and East, rich and poor, white and black, men and women. Freedom-loving iconoclasts, they embarked on their Christ-inspired revolution by regulating every word and gesture they used. Self-effacing to a fault, they had the audacity to think that by scrubbing their own floors, they could help to remake the world. As an American scholar of British history, I've long been struck by and frustrated by the amnesia with which the left in Britain regards religion, its forgetfulness of the centrality of religion in the mobilization of radical ideologies. As an American citizen, living in a world only most recently changed, I've often felt frustration at the failure of Christians in this country to acknowledge and mobilize through their radical ideologies of the left, the monopoly of the evangelical right in claiming to speak for and about Christians. So that my aim here is to retrieve a radical left tradition in 20th century Britain and to rescue them from the kind of cliches of saintliness or crankdom, to rescue them from the cliche that says that all those who opposed war in the interwar period were inevitably playing into the hands of appeasers and ultimately playing into the hands of the fascist states of the 20th century. Instead, I look at their contributions to a history of Christianity, ethics, and global citizenship. I explore the way they think about reconciliation, which they defined as the discovery of what people shared in common despite their differences. I don't have time to go into it now, but reconciliation has very little to do with forgiveness, because forgiveness is part of an economy of blame. Reconciliation is part of an economy of gathering together what we have in common and moving forward. One of the claims I make about this project as a whole is that these people developed not just the language, but many of the technologies of the global humanitarian movement of today by developing concepts like Rosa Hobhouse, who was in this paper. She developed the idea of identification with the oppressed. They developed the language of truth and reconciliation. What this allows me to do is to historicize what the philosopher Martha Nussbaum has aptly described as the unresolved tension between patriotism, being rooted in the fatherland or the motherland, and cosmopolitanism, a sense of the bigness of the world and the interconnection of humanity. Now let me begin the actual telling of the story, what I call the first skirmish in Mrs. Hobhouse's war, called Rosa Wages Peace. Rosa is Stephen Hobhouse's wife. Rosa burst into Mrs. Hobhouse's life without any warning in the spring of 1915, when Stephen startled his mother with news that his long search for a bride was finally over. He had only met Rosa 2 weeks earlier at a Tony Bohemian party in North London in the Hampstead district. They had talked all night. They had walked across the great city to the slums where each of them was living, already engaged in benevolent work serving the poor. Rosa had spied Stephen at a Quaker meeting. A whole lot of talking at Quaker meetings. So, and she had admiringly trembled to Stephen's account of the relief work he had done in the Balkans, serving hungry, displaced Muslims during the Balkan Wars. Stephen knew almost nothing about her, other than that she was the daughter of the great and revered Benjamin Waugh, the founder for the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. But he wrote to his mother, "I'm sure you'll love her pretty soon, though you may disagree with some of her views." He promised that he would bring Rosa to meet his parents at Hadspin, the gorgeous country estate, the vast patrimony that he had legally renounced several years earlier on Tolstoyan principles of Christian love and justice. Here's Hadspin today, and I'll briefly give you a sense of the grandeur of this place. This is a favorite, beware of the dog. And this I call the perks of doing history. They actually gave me this whole cottage, and they moved the archive into the cottage with me so I could sleep in it. It was fantastic, unbelievable. And they allowed me to digitize it. I have some of it here. Okay. At the very beginning, Margaret was kind of delighted with Rosa. After all, it was a real wife. And Stephen had been a delicate child, which is a kind of Victorian code word for a kind of unmanly man who was constantly getting hysterical attacks. And he had more bouts of depression. And he did every single remarkable crackpot health body cure known to humanity in that world, and some that were not yet. Stephen had already adopted a life of poverty, living in a slum flat in Hoxton. At age 36, Stephen was not a catch by his mother's own standards. But had Mrs. Hobhouse known more about Rosa and her adventurous past, she would not have been pleased. For this, she was part of a family better known for good deeds and great wealth. She had followed her sister Edna, a quite insignificant artist in modern British history, Edna Clark Hall, to the Slade School of Art in the 1890s with its uninhibited, free-thinking and bohemian atmosphere. This is Rosa standing there. This is a Gwen John image, who has recently enjoyed substantial recovery as a major woman artist of the 20th century. Rosa and Edna were close friends with Augustus John, Gwen John, and that entire circle. The two had refused to hire working-class women to serve as life models, and they themselves had posed nude. This is a big deal, doing this kind of thing. When Margaret first met her in April 1915, Rosa was a Quaker by conversion and earning her living as a child welfare worker. She had moved into the second floor of a radical Christian people's house called Kingsley Hall. And its residents did all of their own housework. Very radical indeed, again, cleaning, cooking, and washing. When Stephen made the mistake of referring to a woman who came and did work for him as a servant, she upbraided him. She is really the first super politically correct woman I've encountered in my research. And she says to him that he was using the rhetoric of subordination to describe his relationship with a fellow human being. Don't do it, Stephen. Okay. Now, Margaret quietly questioned the efficacy of Stephen and Rosa's decision to give up all of their wealth in solidarity with the poor. But she herself had done precisely, not quite precisely that, but had done a small version of that in 1915 when she became the leader of the national economy movement during the war. She urged women munitions workers to save rather than consume the commodities of the nation and accept restrictions without complaint. She herself accepted some restrictions. I've gone into her, I have her papers. And she did cut back on some of her servants. She reduced the amount of dinner parties, and she did other things that, in her mind, were quite substantial, feeling the pinch of the war effort. She never once, however, recognized, oh, here's another picture of Rosa. She never once for a moment recognized that her own female patriotism with the national economy could have been linked to Stephen and Rosa's own ideas about the containment of expenditure for public virtuous reasons. By the spring of 1916, Margaret's vague uneasiness about Rosa and Stephen's experiments in voluntary poverty turned to alarm when Rosa landed in prison. Rosa and her working class friend Clara Cole theatrically dressed in black, like Sisters of Mercy, and distributed pacifist literature, all of which had already been approved by the state censors, through small villages in Bedfordshire. The two peace pilgrims were immediately charged with violating the conditions of the Defense of Realm Act, DORA, which vastly intruded not only into the industrial organization of Britain, but into the civil rights of individual Britons with its censorship and regulations. Rosa was put on trial, and she saw this as a cherished opportunity to show the work of God and love, and she insisted on being thrown into jail. And wonderful prison letters where she rapturously talks about converting prisoners and wardens to God's radical Christian love. More importantly, however, is that while Mrs. Hobhouse dismisses Rosa as a silly goose, she could not dismiss her working class friend Clara Cole. For Clara Cole was a formidable woman who directly challenged the monopoly of the rhetoric of motherhood that Mrs. Hobhouse was linking to the military service of the nation by using motherhood as an argument for pacifist feminist socialism. Here we see Clara Cole, don't shoot fraternity. She is the militant pacifist feminist embodied. And she urged women, Clara Cole did, to sit in judgment upon the government for murdering their sons. In her bitter poem Alternative, she argued, better barren women than children bred for war, better death in birth than manhood trained for murder. In the months and years ahead, Margaret Hobhouse, like Clara Cole, refined and polished her language of motherhood as a public controversialist and private memorialist. She, like Cole, deployed this rhetoric with its capacious but mobile moral capital, the kind of claims you can make through motherliness, to defend the rights of conscientious objectors. But let me be absolutely clear. Nothing brought Mrs. Hobhouse and Clara Cole together. They remained inveterate enemies because they differed fundamentally on the justness of the war and on the duties of women in times of war. I would argue that Mrs. Hobhouse's task was even more difficult than Clara Cole's, because what she had to balance, what she had to juggle in defending and advocating for the rights of conscientious objectors was an almost unbearable burden. She needed to figure out how to love, support, and admire her three younger sons fighting in the Western Front, while her oldest son, Stephen, objected to war altogether. Now, let me turn then to this story of this remarkable political and human achievement by this woman in balancing these competing claims upon her. Conscription, initially imposed on single men in January 1916 with the Military Services Act and extended to include married men in late May, utterly transformed the political and moral landscape of war on the home front in Britain. going to war was no longer a function of right moral action in which you volunteered to do it. You were compelled to do it. And what this meant is that the economy of shaming those who had not enlisted no longer made sense. But more fundamentally, Mrs. Hobhouse knew that conscription was a desperate and terrifying prospect for her son Stephen. While some saw conscription as a violation of fundamental rights of Britons and Englishmen. So, for example, I would call this pacifist patriotic nationalism, where pacifists largely say that conscription will turn free-born Englishmen into slaves by taking away their ethical and moral obligation to choose to serve and forcing them against their will to engage in warfare. But what mattered most for Margaret was that Stephen would fall under the shadow of the state's coercive authority. For Stephen was an absolutist, not just a pacifist, but an absolutist, who would not accept any form of alternative service that had been established by the liberal state. When they created this category called the Conscientious Objector, they came up with a system that said, okay, we're going to be able to prove that you're legitimately an objector. And they had different categories of objectors. Well, he was the most extreme, the one who would do absolutely no form of service. So she knew that Stephen would no doubt come under its purview. Stephen had many, many ways he could have avoided falling under the state's punitive regime. His medical records alone, constant nervous breakdowns, illnesses, he would have been exempted. He was also a Quaker minister. He could have been exempted on those grounds. But Stephen saw all of those as loopholes of escape that he refused, because he insisted, as a man of conscience, on confronting the state. Now, these tribunals that had been convened to determine whether or not you really have a conscience were often brutal, especially at the beginning of the war. Two conscientious objectors who were seen as endangering the entire warfare machine. Eva Gore Booth, most famous as a pacifist feminist and editor of the sex reform journal Urania, left a quite moving account of one of these tribunals, in which the vicious head of the tribunal pointed out that the delicate architect who had refused to serve took lots of hot baths. That's kind of a code word. A certain kind of man takes a lot of hot baths, and he's not particularly manly, and he's not the right sort. Now, while Stephen's story is a riveting one, and I have an immense amount I could say about it, today what I'm focusing on is Margaret Hobhouse's response to Stephen's story, because I'm going to argue that that was vastly more historically important than anything Stephen ever did. The ghost of Stephen Hobhouse, at least the version of Stephen Hobhouse that Margaret Hobhouse crafted and circulated in public, hovered over public and private debates about the moral and political status of conscientious objectors, who were in turn the bogeymen of debates about patriotism, citizenship, the liberal state, and masculinity. And here I want you just to think that, as we know in almost all political contests and in times of war, certain figures come to be embodiments of all of what's either right or wrong about a regime. That's what I mean by a bogeyman, a kind of means by which they become emblems and stand in for all sorts of problems. Now, what Mrs. Hobhouse wanted to do was, in some sense, to pluck Stephen from his self-chosen obscurity. This is a guy who hated all publicity. He simply wanted to do good in the world and not have it be recognized. And yet Margaret, forever ambitious about this son, in a sense, transformed his public humiliation and imprisonment as a conscientious objector into a way of making him into truly a man of the highest worth, morally and intellectually, and a household name, briefly, in modern British history. Margaret's efforts were a nightmare for the leaders of the War Office, Lord Derby and General Childs, who were denouncing Conscies as the scum of the earth, as they recruited, trained, and deployed soldiers to serve and die in the trenches. And interestingly, what this produced were lots of divides between public pronouncements and private sentiment. Here's a letter from Lord Derby, an arch-militarist in charge of recruitment and in this military war effort, in which he says quite clearly that he cannot let the question of conscientious objectors depend on one man, and yet personally he would rejoice if Stephen were released. These were the kind of agonized and agonistic choices that people had to make in these difficult times. Hobhouse was a problem that needed to be solved for the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, because inside his war cabinets were two key converts to Mrs. Hobhouse's lobby: Stephen's godfather, Lord Alfred Milner, and Jan Smuts, the general. Above all, Mrs. Hobhouse's campaign for her son's release was a terrific windfall for those who were opposed to militarism and conscription, like the philosopher, mathematician, Bertrand Russell, who was chair of the No Conscription Fellowship. How did Margaret Hobhouse transform her son's private drama into a public controversy with such widespread repercussions? She launched an extraordinary letter-writing campaign to all of her vast network of friends and relatives who really controlled the levers of power. And yet, none of it seemed to work. Stephen was tossed into prison in Wormwood Scrubs, where he, like all the other prisoners, was subjected to an initial 2-month period of enforced solitary confinement and silence, under a cat-and-mouse act refined and used to punish the radical campaigners for women's suffrage, the suffragettes. As soon as you were released for prison, he was then told to report and put on his uniform as if it were all starting over again, and then court-martialed once again and tossed back in prison again, and this time for 2 years of hard labor at Exeter Prison. Stephen's second imprisonment shocked his mother. Surely, common sense and fair play suggested there was something wrong in liberal England when men like her son were compelled to endure such injustice. Fueled by indignation and fear for Stephen's very survival, Margaret Hobhouse decided to bring her case before the public in the spring of 1917 by writing a short book about the barbaric treatment of imprisoned absolutists. In substance, it differed very little from dozens and dozens of other books. At its core were a series of case studies of the histories of sufferings of individual men of conscience that would be familiar to anyone, any reader of radical Protestant literature from the 17th century. This kind of trial of sufferings. What made this book, I Appeal Unto Caesar, so powerful and an overnight bestseller was the fact that its author, who strategically called herself Mrs. Henry Hobhouse, was the wife of the Right Honorable Henry, mother of Captain Paul and Lieutenants Arthur and John. And she was a firm supporter of Britain's use of military force to defeat her enemies. She astutely exploited the powers of the weak by likening herself to the lowly early Christian who begged the omnipotent Caesar for mercy and justice. Modulating her voice perfectly across a range of contradictory motherly or maternal registers, she had to find a way to tell Stephen's story that would make people sympathize with him as a suffering human being and identify Stephen and other absolutist objectors to war with freedom-loving principles, the very essence of British patriotism that Brits felt were sacred to both national character and to love of country. Not the easiest thing to do, even more so given the particulars of Stephen's life. How could she tell his life story, make you care about it, and somehow doctor his life so that you wouldn't despise him as the embodiment of the enemy? After all, for example, Stephen had been a student in Germany in the pre-war years, and he had fallen head over heels in love not only with German Kultur, but with a married nurse, Schwester Agnes. With the outbreak of war, he and Rosa and the Christian Radicals had literally thrust their bodies before angry mobs in the slums of London to protect Germans and German emigres, bakers in their community, against the mob. Pacifists had long been linked in the public imagination to the fringe of social, sexual, and political ideologies, vegetarians, voluntary celibates, simple lifers, who were all critics of bourgeois materialism. English Tolstoyans, followers of the great Tolstoy, the Russian Christian radical, including Stephen and Rosa, were essential links in a heterodox circle of sexual and social rebels from the 1890s onwards. Unfortunately for Mrs. Hobhouse, the facts of her son's life corroborated every worst bias and prejudice that the public had against pacifists. By June of 1916, such eccentricities had taken on a distinctly sinister aspect, the tireless work of Arnold White, a leading polemicist of the pre-war radical right, and a champion of the exclusion of immigrant Jews to Britain in the 1880s and 90s and early 20th century. The international menace of Jews had morphed into a fifth column of those who loved Germany and who supported peace. These people, he thundered, loved the vices of the city of the plain. They're sodomites. They're homosexuals. Palestine taught nothing to Potsdam. For to love Germany was to be like Germany, and Germany had been rocked by sexual scandals in the highest places on the eve of World War I, and White explicitly linked English pacifism to German vice, and in particular, German homosexuality. Recruiting posters typically showed women sending off their manly men to war. Unfortunately and rather stupidly, the No Conscription Fellowship, this is their propaganda. Not necessarily beautifully designed to deflect those who might view pacifists as linked to sexual heterodoxy. We could talk a long time about the male gazes here, but we won't. More powerfully, the imagery of the Brits echoed unmistakably the imagery of the German homophile homosexual rights movement. Here's Der Eigene from Adolf Brandt. So, in other words, everything was stacking up against this campaign. But what Mrs. Hobhouse did was to edit Stephen's life, and to edit it severely and effectively. And what she mostly focused on was her trump card, her unique authorial position as a patriotic pro-war mother. And she said movingly that she felt less distress at the fate of her sons battling in the war because they got the approval and admiration of their fellow citizens, while her son underwent for his faith a disgraceful sentence in a felon's cell, truly rejected and despised of all men. Now, this was the essence of the book's emotional appeal. But the next section, that was after the beginning, operated on a completely different, archly philosophical and quite brilliant level. It didn't sound much like Mrs. Hobhouse. And there was a good reason, because she wrote almost none of it. Its ghost author was none other than perhaps the most brilliant man of letters and thinker of that generation, Bertrand Russell himself, who used Mrs. Hobhouse to ventriloquize his radical pacifist views through her militant, patriotic, motherly voice. This annoyed his female collaborator at the No Conscription Fellowship, Catherine Marshall, very ambivalent that all of a sudden the cause for which they had labored so hard was headline news, and that people were beginning to change their views, all because the great Mrs. Henry Hobhouse had decided to take them up. And this is what Catherine Marshall said. This is in her diary. Mrs. Hobhouse had no sympathy with her son, no appreciation for his fine disinterestedness. She was just anxious to make herself more comfortable by getting some of Stephen's discomforts abated. Russell's own assessment was no less devastating. Stephen had convinced his mother, Russell jotted at the bottom of one of Margaret's letters, that Christianity and war were incompatible. So Mrs. Hobhouse had given up Christianity. Mrs. Hobhouse's clandestine collaboration with Russell was the sort of bending of the truth that so deeply hurt and violated Stephen, who believed in absolute truthfulness of purpose and action. This didn't bother Mrs. Hobhouse at all. It was a small price to pay to secure her son's freedom. Now, what did the British public make of Mrs. Hobhouse's book? Everyone concurred with her. really, virtually everyone, other than the extreme left pacifist press, that the British cause in fighting was just, and that COs, Conscies, were not merely wrong, but to quote John Galsworthy, cracked about peace, fanatics, irritating people. The Graphic pithily remarked, the CO is probably necessary for the life of the community. So are Epsom salts. Many, like Galsworthy, agreed that COs like Stephen deserved to be released because they had passed the necessary and only true test of conscience. They were willing to suffer the extreme pains to prove that they were genuinely committed to conscience. Now others, like Phyllis Cloud, wrote in and said, how can a punishment be both omitted as unfair and at the same time constitute the only proof of genuineness of conscience? You following? No. Okay. COs depended on an unjust system to prove that they were just people. Really, if this business were not so tragic a reality, another reviewer quipped, it would seem like a humorous fantasy. In fact, the non sequiturs of false reasonings connected with the trial of the conscientious objector, this is in response to Stephen's trial, remind me nothing so much as the trial of Lewis Carroll's Knave of Hearts in the Court of Wonderland. The root of this insoluble non sequitur lay in the very origins of the conscientious objector as an expression of liberal values and of the Liberal Party, that's a capital L. The British state had first tested its ideas about conscience by allowing parents to apply and go through a procedure to enable them on the matter of conscience to not have their children get vaccinated. So a big anti-vaccination movement. But that had really done nothing to prepare the way for the issues of conscience in time of war. An average man explained to the Manchester City News, after reading Mrs. Hobhouse, that the government should never have created the conscientious objector, invited him to avow himself, give him forms to fill up, induced him to come forward, because no human tribunal could ever judge the state of a man's heart, the workings of his conscience. If the CO was the fruit of liberal logic that sought to nurture right moral action in its citizens through respect for individual conscience, he also revealed the incapacity of liberalism to develop a credible truth mechanism for differentiating the immoral slacker from the fanatical man of conscience, like Stephen Hobhouse. Galsworthy's controversial review introduced another key theme that hit a raw nerve. The War Office was bullying COs, Conscies, and it was un-English. Now what happens is that supporters of conscientious objectors borrow a page from the Indian nationalist movement and WWI Britain, who wrote in The Moral Poverty of England that the unjust and petty tyrannies and despotisms of the way the English ruled the Indian Empire threatened to transform the manly Englishman into the effeminate, despotic Oriental. So by, in a sense, practicing despotism, you turn into that which is the opposite or your nemesis. And likewise, over and over again, readers of Mrs. Hobhouse's book decided that noble Britons were turning into inhuman Huns. That's the word for the Germans. On December 1917, Stephen Hobhouse and a few other prominent absolutists were released from prison because of their deteriorating medical condition. The leaders of Britain's warfare state had decided to break the 6 months impasse caused by Mrs. Hobhouse's war. But they did so without conceding that absolutists had a right for total exemption to enter into military or be part of the military warfare state. This was precisely the triumph of expediency over principle that Mrs. Hobhouse had long sought and that Stephen so desperately rejected and abhorred. He wants it to be a matter of principle. His life is about principle. Internal evidence strongly suggests that Lord Curzon brokered the deal inside the Lloyd George wartime lobby. And the names are not that important. You get it. Lord Curzon, he's a great, major, noble figure, militarist leading this effort, who also has a checkered record in the imperial sphere. He brokers a deal between the pro-Hobhouse people, led by people who absolutely supported the right of the state to conscript soldiers, Alfred Milner, and the War Office, led by Lord Derby. It strongly suggests that the price the War Department extracted for capitulating to the demands of the Hobhouse lobby. In other words, we'll release Stephen. What did they demand back? At this time, the British state is countenancing a major piece of legislation that is most famous for giving women the vote, as well as giving soldiers the right to vote. The soldiers, without getting into a lecture that I'm sure Dan might give, got disenfranchised often because they didn't have a stable residence. And so here was a way to make sure that the heroes could vote and that the women who had supported the war effort could also vote. But part of this deal was that conscientious objectors would be disenfranchised for 5 years after the official end of the war. What part Stephen Hobhouse had played in this drama was also something that he never knew. This disenfranchising clause, the one that would say COs don't get to come in to have the right to vote for 5 years, encountered some significant, actually very numerically insignificant but rhetorically powerful opposition, none other than by Lord Hugh Cecil, who was a successful recruit to the Hobhouse lobby, the bachelor son of the great Tory imperialist Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, a high Anglican conservative ideologue. How did he defend the right of the conscientious objector? In his famously high-pitched voice, he said, "How awful that the conscientious objector, a man of principle, should be disenfranchised, while men of odious lusts should still be allowed to vote." Once again, a series echoing actually the suffragettes themselves in the ways that they gathered the vote. We are moral, we have the right to vote, but we establish our moral authority by finding another group of people who are immoral, who are abject, who simply don't deserve rights: the homosexual. And this becomes extremely powerful, of course, because it plays into widespread public horror at the supposed revelation that there was a German black book which contained the names of 47,000 homosexuals in Britain, including the Liberal Prime Minister, who had set all this story in motion, and his wife, and a celebrated female dancer in London's West End. Edward Carpenter, Britain's preeminent champion of gay rights, thanked Mrs. Hobhouse for using Stephen's case to wake up the nation to its injustices. He misgauged the political climate badly. If Stephen Hobhouse's altruistic life and sufferings for liberty of conscience shadowed public discourse on liberal citizenship, on patriotism, and on Britishness, the homosexual shadowed debates about the status and citizenship of pacifists and conscientious objectors. In yet another profound violation of Stephen's principles of Christian love, Lord Hugh had preserved the rights of COs, or at least tried to, he didn't succeed, by taking away the rights of the homosexual. And I do want you to reflect in this great moment in our national history, when yesterday the first person of African descent has become our president, that this was also a moment of disenfranchisement of the sexual citizenship of lesbian and gay Americans in California and all sorts of other ballot measures across this nation. We have not yet escaped this particular conundrum of rights discourse and making claims about rights. Ironically, as soon as Stephen was released, Mrs. Hobhouse wrote exultantly a letter to her son Jack, fighting somewhere in France. "I wonder where you are." And then with obvious pleasure, this preeminent defender of the rights of the conscientious objector commented to Jack, "Jack, you seem to have killed a lot of Germans. That is a desideratum, highly desirable." And then she says, "My 6 months' labors are crowned with success. Today, Stephen has been released. I have made superhuman efforts, written hundreds of letters, and published countless things. His protest, no doubt, has had its effect, and he is at present a very well-known character. I hope he may live to preach the gospel of love in a better world." Stephen and the case had made conscientious objectors somewhat more palatable because they had presented them as good people, and they had appealed to the goodness of a British public. Jan Smuts had argued that the Hobhouse imprisonment was causing profound misgivings to thousands of good people who in no other way favor conscientious objectors. Harold Begbie was one such good person. Begbie was a right-wing militarist and evangelical ideologue. He was one of the key promoters of military recruiting. He believed in the therapy of the Salvation Army. He condemned socialists, jazz, homosexuals, black music, women who smoked, and everything else that he saw as wrong with modern life. But after he read I Appeal Unto Caesar, he believed that Mrs. Hobhouse's version of Stephen's life was a subject that touched him deeply. He commanded an immense popular readership as a political columnist and essayist, and he wrote a novel about Mrs. Hobhouse and her 4 sons. Mr. Sterling sticks it out. It completely eradicated every irregularity in Stephen's life and made him a poster boy for virtuous English manliness and objection. Stephen, far from being a symptom of the queer, decadent world of the well-to-do, had now become its antidote in Begbie's hands. The Prime Minister, Lloyd George, had endured far too much of the real Stephen Hobhouse to tolerate his fictional alter ego, Mr. Sterling. He blocked the novel's distribution. It languished in a printer's warehouse for over a year until the Home Secretary decided it was no longer a threat to national security. Stephen became, in a sense, the darling of many different groups, used to serve different purposes. He, in a sense, despite his rejection of liberalism and his radical socialist pacifism, becomes the poster child for liberal values. Gilbert Murray, one of the great thinkers and men of letters of the age, transforms Hobhouse into the iconic figure of the man who fought against the masked power of the state. And he likened him to only one other human soul, so great and vast that he had ever encountered, Mohandas Gandhi, who later in life would, in fact, work closely with Stephen and Rosa Hobhouse as part of their campaigns for Indian nationalism and anti-imperialism. I want to end this. In 1917, Margaret wrote to Stephen a loving but frank letter. She admired the depth of his religious and social convictions. She believed that if there were a God, then Stephen had surely understood God's message. But given the nature of the world as it was, it made no sense trying to live a truly Christian life. To do so verged on irresponsibly squandering the gifts that if there were a God, that God had given you. In many respects, Mrs. Hobhouse's anticipated Reinhold Niebuhr's assessment of the great Protestant theologians of the 20th century of the noble but misguided efforts to live out the revolutionary implications of Christ's teachings in an irremediably immoral society. Niebuhr conceded that men and women like Stephen and Rosa rested their vision of God on Jesus' law of love, but by rejecting all forms of conflict, he contended, they disarmed the oppressed from taking away one of their most potent tools. What does it mean to tell those who are oppressed that they cannot at least use the threat of violence as a way of overthrowing an unjust system? Their Christian perfectionism, he argued, consigned them to political irrelevance. As I continue to wrestle with and ponder with the meaning and significance of my subject's contributions to modern history, I need to take seriously far-reaching critiques of their vision of Christian revolution, world citizenship, and reconciliation, and not just from Western theologians like Niebuhr, but from thinkers and activists like the untouchable Dalit critic of Gandhi, Ambedkar, and the Martinican psychologist of necessary violence. Violence must be necessary for the oppressed, Frantz Fanon. But I hope I have demonstrated through Mrs. Hobhouse's war that my subjects were in no sense politically irrelevant, that their views had and do still have a great deal to teach us about peace and poverty, about gender and justice, about patriotism and politics. Thank you. And I would love to take any questions or comments, if that, in that torrent of words, if it actually provokes some thoughts of your own about our world today or about the past and your intellectual interests. Yes?
How old was Stephen at the time of his first imprisonment?
He's 37. And he is a very broken man. He does manage to write the seminal treatise on prisons and criminal justice that is the kind of founding document of how the Labor Party and the left thinks about penology, and it's still cited by penologists. He co-wrote it with a very important labor leader named Fenner Brockway. And most of Stephen's cohort of conscientious objectors get very quickly rehabilitated. An argument that I left out here is that part of what Mrs. Hobhouse did was restore conscientious objectors as legitimate figures. And by 1924, when the Reconstruction effort had really failed, a lot of the people who were Stephen's friends began to gather significant political offices. And so Stephen, who is quite broken at 37, and he really leads a life of the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life of a scholar. That's organic gardening and all sorts of very fringe things. But he does manage to write this one major treatise. Yes?
I got a little confused by the way things got gendered and the gender analysis and how confusing it got towards the end. I realize it's not consistent. But at some point, is it that the German enemy became homosexual and the British pacifist became the ideal male?
And the British pacifist became?
Became the ideal male? I mean, is it
Okay, no, so a couple of things happened. Pacifism, if you're a pacifist in a time of war, you're saying war is wrong. Not surprisingly, many say that means you're actually pro-German as opposed to anti-war. Now, to be pro-German gets associated with a series of the sexual fringe, in part because of this series of scandals, the Oldenburg scandals which demonstrated the kind of way, a kind of homosexual conspiracy in fin de siècle, in the late 19th and early 20th century Germany, that had moved into the highest circles. So then there's a kind of guilt by association in which by being by supporting the rights of Germans, you take on the sexual taint that's part of them. So what Mrs. Hobhouse needs to do is somehow try to free Stephen from being viewed as homosexual. But, ironically, at the very moment after Stephen is getting released, I'm arguing that there's a deal that gets made, and that though the Hobhouse lobby decides that they will allow conscientious objectors to get disenfranchised for 5 years, Hugh Cecil makes this big speech saying, no, don't do that, it's wrong. And what does he do? He reinvokes the specter of the homosexual, but this time he differentiates the pacifist from the homosexual and says, pacifists are honorable men. After all, we have the case of Stephen Hobhouse. Meanwhile, odious men, not altruistic and kind and good men who give up huge fortunes and live among the poor and educate them, they're still going to have the vote. How terrible is that? What a great crime that would be. Did that clarify it? So, and thank you for asking. I was doing a lot of on-the-spot compression to keep to those 50 minutes, and I'm sorry if I muddled it a bit along the way. Yes?
I was thinking of your discussion of Niebuhr's criticism and the Russian Revolution, or the Russian pacifist, the Tolstoy, but people before Tolstoy eventually come to the same conclusion, and they trend to a path of violence in Russia. By 1860s, they start with these kind of Chernyshevsky-inspired communes. By the 1880s, they're firing on the Tsar. So I was thinking, you say that maybe perhaps they're not irrelevant, that the pacifism maybe has a place to go, but at the same time, you point out how Stephen gets hijacked.
Right.
That he loses control of his own image, his message, he becomes a liberal, something he probably despised.
And also the right wing.
And
Christian evangelical, liberals.
He's all in support of the cause, right? So how do you
And by the way, there's a really interesting Russian story, because during the period of Stephen's imprisonment, of course, we go from the provisional government to the October days of 1917, and in which we have the full-fledged specter of Bolshevism and the kind of, the famous Countess Panina gets kicked out and Alexandra Kollontai comes, and there's going to be a different regime, and none of this liberal bourgeois benevolence, but we're going to have a radical revolution of the proletariat. And this gets used in the anti-Stephen rhetoric. So people, in fact, say that if you let Stephen out of jail, you're going to allow the maximalists. So Edmund Goss calls them the anarchists. He doesn't, it's all sort of in transition there. So they are really aware of this story of Russia. So, but help me, what's the particular piece?
So I think Niebuhr's criticism is somewhat valid in that this radical pacifism does end up being conservative. And Stephen himself can't seem to control. He loses sight of his own. He loses control of his own image, of his own rhetoric and political belief.
Right. So one of the things I've tried to highlight is that when we discuss issues of conscience, and more fundamentally, when we move into serious thinking about human rights, that we forever come into these dilemmas, and that there are not easy answers. So that, for me, when I first read Niebuhr's critique, which had been provoked when Stephen's friend Muriel Lester and he shared a platform in, I think, the 1930s in Chicago, I was kind of surprised, because Niebuhr himself had, during the war, been pretty attracted to pacifism. And I didn't expect a kind of liberal Protestant of the kind of somewhat of the left to say that pacifists got it wrong. And yet it is a powerful argument. What do you do? Why, if you take away from the oppressed this possibility of using violence, at least as a tool, you take away one of the few things that they might have. And so I don't, in fact, pretend that I, for myself, have come to a happy conclusion on this. I think, for example, it echoes the famous saying in South Asian history that it took a fortune to keep Gandhi in poverty. It's one of those many paradoxes that the power of pacifism may in some sense depend upon the potential of some to engage in forms of violence in the name of that kind of vision of justice. Or where do the fault lines come between the socialist, the pacifist, and the feminist inside this bundle that my particular subject saw as bound together through the law of love? And so I in no sense have pretended that I've solved it. In fact, that's one reason why rhetorically, intellectually, I end by, in a sense, critiquing the project that in any number of ways I feel kinship for, by saying, wait a minute, if the world, since I concur with Mrs. Hobhouse that in some sense it is unlikely that we will have the kind of world that we would need for Stephen's and Rosa's law of love to do the work that they so believed it could do. So I remain in this sense, I don't have on offer for here a solution to it. And I guess I take the scholar's line, which is I hope at least I've illuminated some of the tensions and problems and some of the things that we need to think about when we engage in these conversations. Yes?
Well, what motivated Jan Smuts, an ostensibly military man, to support so early on a conscientious objector?
Yeah, these are entirely, well, this is a great story, actually. Stephen's beloved older cousin. I wasn't able to map out for you just how unbelievably connected to everybody who was anybody in the world of power, of letters, of politics, Stephen Hobhouse is, both through the maternal and paternal line. But Stephen's beloved cousin, who is the hostess of the party where he meets Rosa, is Emily Hobhouse. Emily Hobhouse is probably the single most important white European woman heroine in contemporary South Africa, where her statue stands. It will be Emily Hobhouse Goes on a fact-finding mission and shows that the Brits are creating concentration camps where they are sequestering women and children, Afrikaans women and children, and that there is astonishing rates of mortality. And she then becomes this heroine of as a critic of British imperialism through this feminist, really, and mother-centered critique of the British state's failure to protect the defenseless women and children under its protection during the Boer War. So Smuts sees Hobhouse and Emily as part of this circle as, wow, this is a chance for me to give back. Milner is his godfather, and through the whole series in which the right and the left in Britain often converge in their use of benevolence and charity as a common ground. And there are a whole series of detailed reasons how Alfred Milner and Stephen's father were good friends, and Milner's role in helping Stephen do social work in the slums. Because Milner was very devoted to helping the poor himself. He was the chairman of the most famous class-bridging institution in that era called Toynbee Hall, and he is the chairman of the board of that institution. So it's, again, it's his personal networks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you talked about that, because I wanted to ask you how much Stephen Hobhouse's case is inflected by his class, his elite familial ties, but also by his marital status, right? He's not a single man, which maybe makes him less, questionable. I'm assuming he didn't have any children.
No children.
So
That's another chapter.
Okay, yeah.
Rosa wrote a sex manual to try to teach Stephen how to do it. And you can read the book, but the key, should you want to know, is olive oil. But anyway.
No, I just wanted you to talk about that. I don't want to know. I don't think I want to know.
Rosa, though, I think she's absolutely an extraordinary figure, and she actually was extraordinarily courageous, and they worked very hard, and their papers and diaries and letters are extraordinarily frank, and they had been lost. I'm the first person to get into these papers. They were lost in the Somerset countryside for many, many, many decades in a barn, not on the family estate.
But does she write any appeals for her husband's release, or?
Oh, well, she doesn't want him released, just as he
That's
doesn't
okay.
want. She doesn't want to be
Okay.
released. None of them want to be released because they want principle to triumph. The only conditions of release that Rosa and Stephen would accept was the state's capitulation of the right for absolute exemption for people of conscience. Nothing short of that would do. And yes, the one person who has written about this story highlights very, very much the ways in which the class and economic privilege of the Hobhouse connections is crucial for Stephen's release. Now, absolutely true, and I show the triumph of its expediency over principle, but I don't, and I admire that treatment. I think it's a worthy one, but I don't think it actually gets at, it's a different kind of history. It's not the history that deals with culture, it's not a history that seeks to ethically engage with what I would say the mind and the heart, which I am attempting to do in this project and in telling the story the way I've chosen to, which is less that, okay, the old boy network triumphed and a woman knew how to use it. True, but there's so much more that happens, so many more effects. Yes?
So I'm fascinated by the dynamic between Stephen and his mother, because he didn't want to be released. She wrote this book where she wrote a false history for him, or a highly edited version of his life. So in the sources that you now have access to, do you have any insight into the dynamic between Stephen and his mother?
I have a tremendous amount of insight into that dynamic.
He slept with the documents.
And Stephen did read the book, and he was happy about it. And in a sense, Stephen, in the whole book, Stephen is probably a half a page. So there are many, many other people's lives, and everyone's lives are fairly edited. He was happy about it. And then
the opening chapter of this particular project is, looks at the problem of what does it mean to become an ethical human being. And how do you do that in relationship to the gifts and legacy and burdens that your parents convey to you through their own lives. And for the people I'm looking at, their parents were extraordinarily do-gooding types of the highest order, but they did it in a world which assumed class privilege, in a world that assumed that doing for others was a gift that those above gave to those below. My subjects radically critique that, but in doing that, I explore how each of them had to work out a double dynamic, at once a philosophical, ethical dilemma. What does it mean to be a person who acts justly in the modern world? And how do I do that without either trashing mom and dad or buying into everything they said? So I explore it in very great depth. The particular beauty of this story is that Stephen is hired by his family to write his mother's life. And it's the final working out of this extraordinary drama of this mother and son. And it's a very moving book. Through the world of the internet and Abe Books, I was able to buy one of the couple hundred copies that were privately printed, so I own it. I didn't bring it with me today, I should have. But that whole book is yet another way in which he works out this relationship. And it's part of this coming together of these deeply estranged, often, mother and son. And with his father, he's extraordinarily estranged for many, many years. And at his father's funeral, he reads out loud this absolutely gut-wrenchingly beautiful poem about a son's need to love his father, even though his father abhorred his son's choices. So it remains a very powerful drama. And one of the things that I'm trying to do with this is to free us from thinking about the late Victorians and then Bloomsbury. In other words, a kind of, we go from high-minded, ethical, repressed Christians to Lytton Strachey saying the word semen out loud in 1910. I'm interested in a somewhat more explicitly political and a much more ethically guided relationship between high Victorianism and what we might call, in literary circles, modernism.
We're going to have to give our speaker a chance to catch breath and
Thank you.
rest. We can continue.